I cannot believe in God unless I know what kind of God I'm supposed to believe in. Well, the kind of God proclaimed by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is an omnipotent God, a being who is all-powerful. What does all-powerful mean? Can this omnipotent God do everything? Literally everything? This kind of God lives or dies, so to speak, exists or does not exist, based on its claim to be all-powerful. God's omnipotence is bedrock theology. But even I can think of lots of things God cannot do. Little me. So how is God all-powerful? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and closer to truth is my journey to find out. Here's why God's omnipotence disturbs me. If God does not exist, I may find so much trouble with God being all-powerful, such that I might reject God and save myself continuing agitation. On the other hand, if God does exist, I may find deeper appreciation of God's nature or essence, such that I might find my belief, now weak, to be strengthened. I'm skeptical, I admit, which is why I begin at Oxford, England, with the Nolloth Professor of the Philosophy of the Christian Religion, Brian Leftow. If anyone can be an expert on God's nature, it's Brian. Brian, most people have heard that God is omnipotent. What are the kinds of things that God does or has power to do that would fall under this category?
A decent start at a definition of God's being all-powerful would be to say that God is so powerful that at any time, He can bring about anything that can be brought about at that time. God can create any possible thing. He can make animals of any species. He can make any kind of universe that He wants. He can make any kind of subatomic particle that He wants. Notice I said at a certain time. Most people would say the past can't be changed. And so you don't want to say that God could change it if it's impossible that it be changed.
So that God could never make it the case that I didn't exist.
Before you existed, He could have brought that about. Now it's too late.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
So what are some other things that God can't do and still be all-powerful?
Well, He can't make 2 + 2 = 5. He can't make a contradiction true. Those are things that are just absolutely impossible. And because they're impossible, they're not things that can be brought about at any given time by anyone, even by God.
And how about God as a creator? Is that a one-time event? Is it a continuous activity?
God is not just the creator at the instant at which time began, but on the standard theistic belief, He constantly sustains the world in being. He hasn't made it independent of Him so that it just runs along on its own. God is always upholding it in such a way that if He wanted the world to cease to exist, He wouldn't have to do anything except stop doing what He's doing all along.
How important is the concept of God's omnipotence to our appreciation of what God, if such a being exists, is?
It's important in 2 respects. One, it's part of His perfection. It's part of the things we worship Him for, that he's that powerful. The other is that it's an attribute that has a role in concrete religious life. I mean, religious people believe that God has made promises and He's made predictions. And they don't think these are just pious wishes that God expressed. They think He's powerful enough to bring it off. No matter what the obstacle any creature puts up, He's powerful enough to overcome it. And no matter what the difficulty, He can make His plan come through in the end.
There are things about this world that seem to be in contradiction to the fact that God is all-powerful and God is all-good, and that is the enormity of evil in the world?
To get the problem to emerge fully, you also need to suppose that God is all-knowing, that He could at least know for every evil that it might occur or that it definitely would occur. That God is all-powerful means that He has power enough to stop any evil. It doesn't follow that He has more reason to stop evil in a given case, then he has to let it go, because there might be good purposes for allowing certain evils. A very simple example is, let's say our parents, when we're growing up, allow us to make certain choices for ourselves, because that's the only way we grow to moral maturity. If it is the case that to be morally mature, you must be allowed to choose for yourself, then to have moral maturity, you must allow people at least a chance to do wrong.
How important is that in the overall understanding of God, for God's power to be absolutely maximum as opposed to being extraordinary but not necessarily absolute maximum?
An extraordinary power could be enough to defeat all evil, to bring God's plans about,
create
the universe, sustain it, give us an afterlife. On the other hand, if you want to say that God is absolutely perfect, that you can't even conceive of something better than God, then the only way you can make that affirmation is if you hold that God is literally all-powerful. Because if he's not, then you can think of something better, namely a being who would be just like him, except that he would be all-powerful.
But that of itself doesn't make it real.
True. Actually, the reason we have the idea that God is omnipotent has nothing to do with philosophy. It's there in the Bible.
With careful definition, God's omnipotence can make sense, at least if I cocoon myself in the belief system of true believers. Basically, anything contradicting God being all-powerful is labeled impossible, and thus should not count against God being omnipotent, or for that matter, against God being real. Impossible? If I really thought that there were an all-powerful God, I'd not be so quick to conclude that what, to our finite minds, seems impossible is, to an infinite mind, really impossible. For example, God could have created a world where every time one has or thinks about two sets of two things, another thing magically materializes, instantly and without exception, so that in this possible world, it would be commonly accepted that 2 + 2 = 5. But my argument fails. 2 + 2 would still equal 4. And the magical addition would be, well, an emergent property in that world, much like, say, the properties of water in our world. The upshot? God's omnipotence can drive me batty. I'd better seek sanity with a non-believing philosopher. At Oxford, I visit Bede Rundle.
Can God make 3 = 25? That's meaningless. It's not a limitation on God's powers or abilities. It just doesn't make sense to speak of this, so we're not going to hold it against him that he can't. Moving a bit nearer action, we have then involuntary acts. So we digest our breakfast. We don't set about doing that voluntarily. It's something that happens to us. God doesn't have breakfast for a start, but could any involuntary act be ascribed to him? There's a whole range with us. Our breathing, our sweating, our blushing, our coughing, our sneezing. These are all involuntary, and we don't really have in God the sort of being who is cut out to engage in these acts. But once more, I think a person could reasonably say, you're not talking about a limitation on God. And what's emerging, perhaps more generally, is omnipotence could be different for different kinds of being. If God doesn't have a body, then there are certain things he cannot do that we can. And then the question is, do you regard that as a limitation? Now, one interesting example here would be God is meant to be everywhere. And that's essential to him. So he can't be nearer the railway station than the post office. Right? It just doesn't arise with him. Well, we can be. Is that, as it were, a virtue that we have that God lacks?
We're now getting a lot of different things that God can't do.
We are,
which,
and we have to assess them all as whether they impinge upon the main core idea here.
Right.
And moving to a slightly more dangerous area for God, we have acts which manifest a virtue. So you can be sober, temperate, good-natured, got a sense of humour. You can be a coward or you can be courageous. Certainly courage is a virtue. Is it a virtue that God could have, or if you like in terms of actions, could he act courageously? And the answer seems to be, well, if you're all-powerful, you're not threatened by anything, and so the opportunity to show courage is simply excluded for you. Well, again, you've got the question, is that a limitation on God's power or not? Then we come back to what is the underlying problem for so many of these issues. Can God do anything in the way we can, in the sense that we can act upon the physical world around us, because we are part of that world with bodies? If God is denied a bodily dimension, then does it make sense to think of him as doing anything in the way we can?
Is the only problem the fact that a God, being immaterial, can't act on the material world?
That seems to me to be, as it were, the next step, because you might say, well, look, central to our idea of God is a being who created the physical universe. And so here, the notion of an action, creating something, would come under scrutiny. And if we have misgivings in this area, it will be because God, in lacking a body, doesn't have what it takes to interact with the physical world.
Bede is an atheist, and when he frames categories of things that an all-powerful God cannot do, he is implying that theology's famously omnipotent God does not exist. I like exploring things that an all-powerful God cannot do, because God's incapacities probe the nature of God. That's why I go see philosopher John Leslie, the co-editor of The Mystery of Existence, Why Is There Anything at All? John suspects that he himself is not an atheist. But is it really God that John believes in? He says it's hard to be sure. John, when people say that God is omnipotent, they think that God can do everything. Everything. Can God do everything?
God certainly can't do everything if by this you mean that he could, for example, make it true that I have never existed, that he could make 2 and 2 make 5, that he could make a problem which was too hard for him to solve and yet would be able to do everything, that he could make a stone too heavy for him to lift. And could God make it true that the very best state of mind which you could have would be the state of mind of dying in agony, that was better than having a tremendously pleasurable and interesting experience? These are standard things which practically all the theologians would accept, are things which God couldn't do because they are utterly impossible.
Do we distinguish between things that are utterly impossible, like logical contradictions, with value difficulties, like creating a situation where somebody dying in agony is a good thing?
It's a fairly standard view that you can't prove by appeal to logic that one thing is better than another. I think that there are some absolute necessities which go beyond what can be logically proved, and that God would be subject to those necessities just as much as to the necessities of not being able to make 2 and 2 make 5 or whatever.
Can God will himself out of existence?
A standard theological view would be that he couldn't, because this would be such a dreadful thing to do, and God would not do dreadful things. But there would be theologians who so much respect the divine freedom that they would say God could will himself out of existence. God could have decided to make a world which was from end to end of negative value, a world which was worse than nothing, all the beings in it having terrible, painful lives and so on. That was within God's power. They put the freedom of God as more important than the goodness of God.
But in that scheme, the freedom of God would allow God to choose the goodness, as opposed to the goodness being a force which imposes a structure on God, no?
Indeed. You could say that if God had to be good, then in some sense this is an imposition on God, but also you could say if God has to have a mind knowing that 2 and 2 make 4 rather than 5, then this is a restriction on God. I'd rather, if I were to believe in God, I'd prefer to believe in a God who didn't think that 2 and 2 made 5, even though the freer God might have this thought in his mind.
How free is God? How powerful? The two questions interrelate. Does God's freedom fight God's power? Assume God has the power to destroy the universe. Is it that God won't do it because God chooses to be good, in which case God is free? Or God can't do it because God is necessarily good, in which case God is not free? Well, either case, God will not destroy the universe, and thus God's power is limited. How else is God's power limited? I go to Notre Dame to ask Catholic philosopher Thomas Flint.
Most theists have not thought that omnipotence means that you can do what can't be done, that you can do the impossible. So it looks as if we have to say God's omnipotence is limited to doing what's possible, what can be done. Many theists have also felt that God's freedom is limited, God's power is limited by our freedom. God can't make us do something freely. And that means that our freedom puts limitations upon what God can do. And at least from our temporal perspective, it surely looks as if time places limitations upon what God can do. Various things have happened in the past, which we think are sort of beyond the range of anyone to change at this point. So those are at least 3 limitations that it seems even an omnipotent being would have. He's going to be limited to doing what's possible. He's going to be limited to doing what's consistent with our freedom. And he's going to be limited to doing what's consistent with, as philosophers sometimes say, the hard facts about the past.
What about some interaction between God's primary characteristics? We say God is all good, so I assume that means God can't do any bad things. Or he can do but won't, or I'm not sure how to phrase it, but his power, his omnipotence is limited by his goodness.
It would be a limitation if God wasn't essentially good, if it wasn't part of his very nature to do what's good. But if God is essentially perfectly good, then his doing something that's evil isn't even possible. So it would involve a contradiction. And therefore, again, if we think of omnipotence as limited to what's possible, saying God can't do something that's evil simply comes under the category of God can't do the impossible.
All right. That would be the case if God's being all good was necessarily true. If it was contingently true, would that make a difference?
I think it would make a difference in that what we would have to say then is that God can do evil things. So we might well think that if God is omnipotent, he has to be able to do things that are evil. And there are some theists who have held this view.
In one sense, that makes God a stronger character, because it's not impossible for him to do an evil thing. He just will never do it.
We hope.
Yeah.
There are many problems, I think, with taking that view. I mean, first of all, you don't have a God who's the Anselmian sort of picture of that than which nothing greater can be conceived, who has all of the perfections we can imagine. Here we have a being who is limited in terms of goodness. Being good isn't part of his very nature.
I could almost make the opposite argument, and that says that if God, it's logically impossible for God to do something that's not good. What character benefit does that have? On the other hand, if it's possible for God to do something bad, but he never does, that's a stronger character.
Well, in one sense of a stronger character, that's exactly right. I mean, God can't have a strong character in the sense of struggling against temptations to do evil in the way that we do. That's a kind of, if you want to call it strength, that we have that God can't have. There are lots of horrors present in our world. If you have a traditional picture of God as one who's perfectly good, we know that these are not things that he wanted to have come about. He may have permitted them for some greater good, but they're not a result of any sort of malevolence on his part. Once we open ourselves to the picture of a God who can do things that are evil, it becomes much more difficult for us to have confidence that God hasn't done things that are evil. And that is not an issue that one who takes the traditional picture of God is ever going to be confronted with.
For believers, explaining evil is no fun. I can understand why. Tom also distinguishes between God being necessarily good and God deciding to do good. While it makes no difference in what God actually does, it makes a huge difference in what God actually is. I'm still conflicted by God's omnipotence, which Western religions require in their belief systems. How about this? Assuming God exists, could God's power have changed after God created the universe? I ask Greg Boyd, a pastor and a theologian who does not fear voicing unconventional views.
Before creation, if you believe in creation, God has all the say-so. You can think of power as say-so. But now God creates a world, and God could still have all the say-so if he created the kind of world where everything operated according to his will. But God created a world where he gave free will to human beings and even to angels. And to the extent that God gives me free will and gives you free will and maybe angelic beings free will, to that degree God limits his say-so. He still has the power to bring it all to an end and exercise omnipotence. But if he created the kind of world where he wants there to be free agents, he can't do that. To the extent that he gives away free will, he gives away shares in omnipotence. So now God's will isn't the only will that gets done in this world. There's a lot of wills that affect what comes to pass.
So your approach significantly limits God's omnipotence.
It limits the exercise of God's omnipotence.
So God made a choice some time back.
At the very beginning, he gave away shares of omnipotence. He gave away say-so. But that's no different than saying this. If God decides he's going to create a triangle, he can't create a circle in that exact same space.
Is that divesting a permanent one, or he doesn't like it, he just takes it back?
No, see, I think that if God could take back the power whenever he wanted, then he never really gave it. He's really just calling all the shots, and when we agree with him, then he makes it look like we have free will, but when we're going against his will, he takes it back.
So part of God's power, you're saying, is to absolutely and permanently and irrevocably divest himself of that power, as it is to the free will of these different beings.
And there's limits around that. The scope and the duration of our free will has boundaries around it, but to the degree that he's given it to us, I believe it's irrevocable. C.S. Lewis said this in his book, Mere Christianity. He goes, some may say this idea that we can say no to God. They may say that is a function of God's weakness. But he says, I see it as the greatest act of omnipotence, that God could create a being who has the power to say no to him. That is true omnipotence.
What is the purpose of that?
Well, because without free will, there'd be no love. And I think love's the ultimate ideal, the ultimate goal.
God could not legislate that.
I don't think so. Say, suppose I was a mad scientist. I could create a microchip that could control every neuron in my wife's brain. It could mandate that she thinks all loving thoughts towards me, says all loving words towards me, and does nothing but perfectly loving deeds towards me. But that wouldn't be genuine love, and I would know it, even if she wouldn't, because I know that whatever she's doing to me and thinking about me, I'm really just doing to myself. So also, God could create a world where everybody thought loving thoughts and said loving words and did loving deeds. But it wouldn't be a world that genuinely had love. Because the only way you can get genuine love is by having a choice. And that means there's free will. And that means that God might not always get his way. In fact, this is why the Bible describes God's providence as a function of his wisdom, more than a function of his power. He's got to outsmart his enemies. He's got to attain his objectives by using his creativity and his resourcefulness. This God who simply decrees what's going to happen and it all comes to pass. That is not, I would argue, the God of the Bible. And so I don't feel like I'm being anthropomorphic by espousing this view.
Exploring God's power gives insight into God's existence, and if God does exist, into what God would be like. If there is a creator God, I do not think it impossible that such a God could do things that we now, with limited understanding, think impossible. What is surely impossible is to know God in God's own existence, to grasp how powerful such a God would really be. On the other hand, I like the idea of God limiting God's own power and limiting it irrevocably. that might enrich human purpose and provide genuine free will. As for supporting God's existence, God being all-powerful, I'm sorry, counts for little. What about my own admittedly shaky belief? How has exploring God's omnipotence affected it? Maybe mildly strengthened it. Mystically, but not conclusively. So I doubt I'm any closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.